Mercedes just dominated the Chinese Grand Prix. But what the FIA found after the race could make that dominance disappear overnight. Because this wasn't just a fast car. This was a car that doesn't lose energy. A system that doesn't fade on the straight. An advantage no other team can explain or replicate. And now, engineers across the grid are asking the same question. Is Mercedes hiding something inside that energy system? Something so effective, the FIA didn't expect it? Because if this is true, we're not talking about a small advantage. We're talking about a loophole that could decide the entire season. Stay here, because the detail that exposes this changes everything. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the FIA is already getting involved. Subscribe now. Right after the Chinese Grand Prix ended, something shifted. Not in the headlines. Not in the celebrations. But in the way teams started looking at Mercedes. Because what seemed like a perfect weekend started to feel like something else. From the very first session in Shanghai, the pattern was already there. Russell leading. Antonelli right behind. Every lap looked controlled. Measured. Repeatable. And that word, repeatable, is where everything begins. Because speed can happen once. Even twice. But when it happens every single lap, without variation, that's when engineers start asking questions. The W17 didn't just look fast. It looked stable. Predictable through corners. Balanced in every phase. No sudden corrections. No visible struggle. And then came the straights. This is where things stopped making sense. Because every car on the grid shares the same limitation. Energy runs out. Deployment fades. You feel it halfway down the straight. That slight drop. That moment where the car stops gaining. Mercedes didn't have that moment. They just kept accelerating. Smooth. Continuous. Like the system never reached its limit. And in modern Formula One, that should not happen. Energy deployment is capped. Strictly regulated. You cannot extend it endlessly. You have to choose when to use it. When to save it. When to sacrifice. But Mercedes didn't look like they were sacrificing anything. And that's where the first real doubt started to grow. Because this wasn't just visible on track. It was visible in the numbers. Speed traces showed a pattern. Not spikes. Not random gains. A consistent advantage from the start of the straight to the breaking point. And that kind of consistency is rare. Even for dominant teams. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Ferrari wasn't far behind. In fact, in the corners, they were strong. Sometimes stronger. Better traction. Better rotation. Cleaner exits. But every time they hit the straight, they lost ground. Again. And again. And again. Not by a huge margin. But enough. Always enough. Enough to lose position. Enough to fail attacks. Enough to decide the race. And that's what makes this different. Because this isn't about one area of performance. This is about a system that works everywhere, without showing weakness. And in Formula One, a car without visible weakness is never ignored. At first, it looked like perfection. Great engineering. Perfect setup. A team operating at its absolute peak. But then, the deeper analysis began. Engineers started asking a different question. Not how fast Mercedes is, but how they're sustaining that speed. Because if that answer doesn't fit within the expected limits, then this isn't just dominance anymore. This is something much bigger, and much more dangerous. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because once teams stopped watching the car and started studying the data, the questions became sharper, more precise, more uncomfortable. After China, engineers began overlaying telemetry. Not just lap times, but how those lap times were built. Meter by meter. Phase by phase. And very quickly, something didn't line up. Because under normal conditions, energy deployment follows a predictable pattern. You push early, you lose later. You save early, you gain at the end. There is always a compromise. Always a limit you eventually hit. But Mercedes didn't show that limit. Their deployment curve looked almost flat. From the moment they exited the corner, to the very end of the straight, there was no visible drop. No clipping. No fade. Just continuous acceleration. And that's where the real concern begins. Because that kind of behavior suggests something very specific. Either Mercedes has achieved a level of efficiency no one else can match, or they found a way to operate in a space the rules don't clearly restrict. Now here's where it becomes even more serious. Because the FIA doesn't just look at what happens once. They look at repetition, consistency, patterns over time. And in China, Mercedes repeated the same behavior every single lap. No variation. No degradation in energy delivery. No signs of managing limits. That's not just performance. That's control at a level that forces investigation. And that investigation is already happening. Quietly. Behind the scenes. Because rival teams have started to raise questions. Not accusations. Not publicly. But directly to the FIA. Asking for clarification. Asking how this kind of energy behavior is possible within the current regulations. And that's how these situations always begin. A question. Then another. Then pressure. And once pressure builds, the FIA has to respond. But here's the key detail. They don't need to prove anything illegal. They don't need to accuse Mercedes of breaking rules. All they need to do is redefine how the rules are interpreted. A technical directive. A small clarification. A subtle adjustment to what is allowed in energy deployment. And suddenly, what Mercedes is doing today might not be allowed tomorrow. And that's the real threat. Because this isn't a minor advantage. This is the core of their dominance. Take away that sustained deployment, and everything changes. Top speed drops. Overtaking becomes harder. Defending becomes weaker. And the control we saw in China starts to disappear. Now think about Ferrari. They're already close. Strong in corners. Competitive on tires. Just missing that final piece on the straights. Remove Mercedes' advantage, and that gap closes instantly. But there's another layer. One that makes this even more volatile. Because inside Mercedes, there is already tension building. Antonelli just proved he can win. Russell has already won this season. 2 drivers. 1 car. And now, potential uncertainty. Because if the car changes, even slightly, that internal balance breaks. And when that happens, mistakes follow. Strategy risks. Aggressive moves. Moments that can define a championship. So now the situation is no longer just technical. It's political. It's psychological. It's about timing. Because Mercedes is at its peak right now. Everything works. Everything aligns. But the attention is growing. The scrutiny is increasing. And the FIA is watching closely. Waiting. Analyzing. Preparing to decide whether this is innovation. Or something that needs to be controlled. And the most important part is that we still don't know exactly what Mercedes is doing differently. That detail, the one hidden inside the way their energy system works, is still not fully visible. But once it comes out, it won't just explain their speed. It will explain why the entire paddock is starting to get nervous. And now, we reach the part that explains why this situation is escalating so fast. Because the FIA is no longer just observing. They're trying to understand something that doesn't behave like it should. After reviewing all the data from China, one detail kept coming back. Not speed. Not lap time. Behavior. How the energy system behaves over an entire lap, and more importantly, over an entire race. Because one fast lap can be explained. Even a few. But maintaining the same energy output, lap after lap, without visible drop, that's where the problem begins. And that's exactly what Mercedes did in Shanghai. Every stint. Every phase. No degradation in deployment. No inconsistency. Just a system that looked perfectly controlled. Now here's where things become very technical, but also very revealing. In Formula One, energy doesn't just appear. It has to be harvested, recovered under braking, stored in the battery, then deployed in specific phases, all within strict limits. So if one team is deploying more consistently than others, it means one of two things. Either they are recovering energy more efficiently, or they are deploying it in a way that maximizes every fraction. And Mercedes might be doing both at the same time. And that combination is what makes this so difficult to analyze. Because it's not one trick. It's a system. A complete integration of engine, battery, and control software. Working together in a way that looks almost seamless. Too seamless. Now imagine how that looks from the FIA's perspective. You see a car that never seems to hit the expected limits. A system that behaves differently from every other team. And data that doesn't quite match the models. You don't jump to conclusions. But you don't ignore it either. You dig deeper. You start asking very specific questions. About deployment timing. About recovery phases. About how energy is distributed across the lap. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Because this is no longer about performance. This is about interpretation. Where does innovation end? And where does regulation begin? And here's the uncomfortable truth for Mercedes. If the FIA decides that their interpretation goes too far, they don't need to prove anything illegal. They just need to adjust the definition. A small clarification. A new guideline. Something that forces all teams to operate within a slightly narrower window. And suddenly, Mercedes loses its edge. Not gradually. Instantly. Now think about the impact of that. A car that just dominated the second race of the season. A car that looked unbeatable could arrive at the next race and feel completely different. Slower on the straights, more exposed in battles, more dependent on strategy and driver performance. And right behind them, Ferrari is ready. Because they don't need a miracle. They just need that one advantage to disappear. But there's something even more important. Something that connects everything we've seen so far. Because if this energy system is the key to Mercedes' performance, then it also explains why the car looks so stable. Why it manages tires so well. Why it never seems under pressure. Because when your energy deployment is predictable, everything else becomes easier. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Not just the speed, the control, the consistency, the ability to dominate without stress. And that's exactly the kind of advantage Formula One tends to regulate. So now the FIA faces a decision. Allow this level of optimization to continue, or step in before it defines the entire season. And whatever they decide, it won't just affect Mercedes. It will affect the entire grid. Because if one interpretation changes, everyone has to adapt. Everyone has to rethink their systems. Everyone has to respond. And that's when the real chaos begins. Because while all of this is happening externally, inside Mercedes, the pressure is already building. 2 drivers, 2 winners, 1 car. And now, uncertainty. Because if performance changes, even slightly, that internal balance shifts. And when that happens, control disappears. So now everything is connected. The dominance in China. The questions from rival teams. The attention from the FIA. The internal tension. All leading to one moment. One decision. One clarification that could redefine the entire season. And the final piece of this puzzle? The exact detail in Mercedes' energy system that might be pushing the limits is still hidden. But once that detail becomes clear, it won't just explain their advantage. It will explain why the FIA might have no choice but to act.